Well, as promised, I'm going to talk today about 19th century missionaries and their encounters with the heathen environment. I'm using the term missionary in quite a wide sense. I'll be using some of the writings of official missionaries of the Church Missionary Society, CMS, those of Graham and Margaret Brooke, and the Reverend Townsend, all of whom travelled up the Niger, though almost a century apart. I'll also be talking about Martha Sherwood, an early Victorian tract writer, not an official missionary, but as an army wife in India, she taught children of the barracks about Christianity. I'll be mentioning Charlotte Elizabeth Tonner, who wrote for religious periodicals and saw her work as a vocation, and the writings of those who wrote for the Sunday at Home, an evangelical family magazine which aimed at Christian education and conversion. I'm jumping around a bit, both in terms of geography and time. Of course, the processes of engaging with the colonial landscape would have changed through the 19th century and varied to a certain extent according to differences in environmental features. However, it's the similarity in the general approaches across the century and across different kinds of landscapes that I'll be talking about today. So, in the 19th century, following the revival of evangelicalism, missionary endeavour expanded more than ever before. All sorts of British people were traversing foreign lands to spread the gospel and bring enlightenment to benighted peoples. Lands they had before only ever heard of in the Bible, they were visiting and living in and trying to bring under the order of British religion and mores. Some of these lands were exotic and dangerous. You see, although the title of this slide is very English, a frightful incident, it's rather exotic. You've got the half-naked native woman in a rather dangerous situation being eaten by a crocodile. So you've got danger and seduction, which of course carries its own dangers, in the one place. So missionaries required a process of domestication of these lands, and some of the ways they tried to achieve this have been talked about before. Women especially were thought to have a domesticating influence on native populations and on British agents abroad, keeping them of course from that temptation. In his essay Queen's Gardens, From Sesame and Lilies, Ruskin associates women with gardens. And this theory is continued in colonial expectations that women would cultivate and domesticate the great outdoors into manageable Victorian gardens. Female missionaries often use the language of cultivation when they talk about their work. They are engaged in God's field, they are sowing seeds and bringing in the harvest. They're generally turning the unprofitable land of the heathen into productive, familiar farmland. However, I would argue that using women to domesticate these landscapes was actually doomed to failure. Despite the most lauded domesticators of India, the Memsahibs, picnicking off china and glassware, which obviously was carried by armies of servants, I think we can agree that it takes more than a teapot and a frilly tablecloth to domesticate the tropics. I just love that picture. Furthermore, female missionaries actually lived in quite an institutionalised professional space. Missionary homes were based in hospitals, mission headquarters and schools. It was hardly a domestic idyll. So a more interesting approach that I think British missionaries used to domesticate these lands was through a project of imagination. The experience of foreign lands was begun before any travelling took place and involved a confluence of many forms of knowledge, including biblical history and mythology, contemporary religious theory, and modern science. The method was at once to familiarise the foreign land and to explain it. The missionaries were also explorers and travellers, and their writing often approaches the genre of travel writing. As we know, travellers often see the land not as it is, but as the guidebook tells them to view it. The guidebook that most missionaries at this time had was, of course, the Bible. And the other guidebook, or the second of God's books, was nature, especially as it was being studied now as a discipline of natural science. Something that epitomised the way these two sources worked together was a British evangelical hobby, which I'm calling biblical botany. Well, botany was very popular at this time, especially given 18th century scientific advances. And my slide here shows olives, a sycamore, which a genus that they discovered in Africa, they said actually produced fig-like fruit. and they use that to explain a part of the Bible. And then down there we've got cedars, which obviously were referred to in the Bible as occurring in Lebanon, and the cedars fruit, but these cedars are from the Chelsea Physic Garden, as I'll go on to explain later. So, reading the Christian Observer, which is usually a rather dry periodical full of sectarian squabbles, one often finds letters from enthusiasts who've translated a biblical plant or animal into a plant or animal known in the contemporary world. So, biology, botany and geography were in effect familiarising and taming the exotic in the Bible, and vice versa. So doubters who had used the fabulous and impossible in the Bible's descriptions of nature to support their doubts had had to eat their words, as the majority then decided that the Leviathan in the Bible was probably the crocodile, and possibly the unicorn was the rhinoceros. So it was a double movement of familiarisation. What was mentioned in the Bible had now been found to be true, and because it was mentioned in the Bible, it was already no longer exotic or threatening. However, in the empire, there were still things that had not been described in the Bible. In Africa, to Graham Brooke, the landscape was confusing, threatening, and unpleasant. For example, the River Niger is awesome in its size, and quite confusing and unfamiliar when it reaches the delta. So when Graham Brooke encountered this, he writes, "After sweeping along for hundreds of miles through the Muslim kingdoms of the Sudan, it turns due south, and leaving the hills near Onitsha, about 6 degrees 10 minutes north latitude, it enters the plain country, and some 60 miles lower down at Abo, it splits into the very many branches which divide and subdivide, so as to form a perfect labyrinth of intercommunicating creeks, and finally, passing through some 30 or 40 miles of swampy mangrove forest, they enter the sea by a score of mouths, which extend over 200 or 250 miles of coastline." As I hope you can see, Brooke is here employing science to explain this rather threatening labyrinth with its score of mouths. He's measured it to a certain degree, and so you can better understand and face it. Yet another way Brooke explains the landscape is through following Martha Sherwood's example of seeing landscape as an outward expression of the state of the population's souls. For Sherwood, in her Indian tracts Little Henry and His Bearer, even the jungle is down to the heathen's lack of faith. See the jungle there. Her description of a part of India here begins positively, but ends with a judgment that Little Henry then echoes. "It is a beautiful country, abounding with cornfields, tops of trees, thatched cottages, beyond which the Rajmahal hills are seen, some bare to their summits, and others covered in jungle." There's a note: "uncultivated wasteland, overrun with brushwoods or reeds, which even now afford shelter to tigers, rhinoceroses, and wild hogs." "This is a good country," says Little Henry. "That is, it would be a very good country, if the people were Christians. Then they would not be so idle, and they would agree together, and clear the jungles, and build churches to worship God in." But at the time that this was written, Sherwood clearly feels the need to explain to children that the jungle is something, in effect, unnatural in the Christian world. The fact that these people have allowed the jungle to spring up and shelter wild animals is scandalous, and the fact that these animals are sheltering there even now shows the urgency of India's need for Christianity. And then there's Brooke's Akrika on the Niger, which he terms a stronghold of Satan. "At low water, many yards of sickly-smelling black mud guard the shore all along. The people have coarse, savage faces, and then their town has a very dirty, squalid look. A terrible outbreak of cannibalism occurred here last autumn, 120 prisoners of war being cooked and eaten in one day." It can be seen that he conflates the landscape with its sickly mud with the human environment, and then with the people. All are dirty and squalid for the same reason of their lack of God, from which of course stems their fondness for eating each other. On the opposite side of the coin, it can be seen that positive landscape features, like Sherwood's cornfields and thatched cottages, are evidence that the population can be brought around to God. Henry believes in the potentiality of India to become a very good country, as he has to believe in the potentiality of the people to convert to Christianity. In Brooke's writings, there's a more scientific appreciation of the quality of a settlement's foundation and its air that suggests that success will be similarly forthcoming. The town he chooses for the mission post is mountainous and built on rocky soil, and all are delighted with the landscape and climate. Rachel Gilmore has written in Grammars of Colonialism how the study of African tribal languages revealed their potential for conversion. In the case of the Xhosa tribe in South Africa, this was argued on the basis of the language's similarity to Hebrew. In addition, these people who'd studied the Xhosa used biblical chronology to locate the Xhosa as Arabs, descendants of Ishmael, son of Abraham, associating them with the wandering tribes of Arabia. This biblical theory of African tribes as either the sons of Ham or the lost Jewish tribes can also be seen in the missionaries' descriptions of the landscape. One of the most comforting things for Brooke is that he can reconfigure the landscape as a biblical struggle. He says, all along the coast, Satan is crippling the convicting power of the gospel, as he tried to do at Philippi of old. So Africa is like Philippi, like biblical lands, which are familiar to Brooke because he reads his Bible. And the Reverend Townsend, during an earlier CMS mission to the Niger, explicitly compares the freed slaves in Sierra Leone, the Yorubans, to the enslaved Jews in Egypt. He says, like the poor captive Israelites when in Babylon, who wept when they thought of their beautiful Jerusalem and their pleasant valleys and hills and vineyards and gardens, so the poor Yorubans yearned for their native land. This comparison suggests that the Yorubans' land could similarly have been cultivated at one time, containing pleasant valleys and hills, and could be again. The characterization of tribes as wandering Jews added weight to the missionaries' already strong faith that the populations of Africa and India could be brought to God. Often believing in the coming millennium's establishment of God's kingdom on earth, any description of the landscape could be imagined to be ameliorable, especially if the state of the landscape and even climate were due to the current state of the population's souls. Little Henry's speech is prophetic, as he imagines all, now one faith, clearing the jungle and cultivating the land. In the Female Missionary Intelligencer, the language is similarly of cultivation. Their work will open springs of living water in the desert, which will have a fertilizing influence in life and blessing to the daughters of India. The empire is to these missionaries like a neglected garden, which only needs watering and clearing for the promised land to emerge. And this promised land, though usually implying the Holy Land, often looks very familiar. It looks a lot like England, with Mrs. Sherwood's thatched cottages and fields of corn. Green and pleasant are usually words associated with positive missionary landscapes. However, due to the heathen state of the population, appearances of greenness and pleasantness right now can be misleading. And little Henry Sherwood notes that at that season of the year when India is most green and beautiful, it's not its most healthy. And the outward appearance of Brooke's mission town in Africa is likewise false. Although the air around it at the time they arrive seems healthy, only a few miles away is a plain that becomes a swamp during the rains, transmitting fevers which doom the mission. And the outward appearance of the Holy Land itself when travellers get there is also confusing. Having heard of Palestine's great fertility, descriptions of the Bible land as green and pleasant, very similar to English countryside, abounded in the imaginary literature of the time. But when they get to Palestine and Lebanon and travel to the Dead Sea, the missionaries encounter deserts and bare hills. Well, the first response to this is to declare the land cursed by God. As Africa is uncomfortable and dangerous due to Satan's stronghold there, the Holy Land has been forsaken due to the rejection of Christ. This suggests that as environments can be watered and fertilised to flourish by missionary action, so the process can be reversed. The Sunday at Home included articles on the geography and botany of the Holy Land almost obsessively. Some pieces were simple biblical botany, but initially the focus is more on religious messages than scientific accuracy. So, in one of these articles, you can read that Tournefort mentions 18 kinds of olives, but the only distinction we find in Scripture is between the cultivated and the wild. The plant, when growing wild and neglected, well represents the Gentile world, when alienated from God and left unaided and undisciplined. Similarly, the questions of where the cedar trees of Lebanon have gone, and whether Palestine was ever as fertile as it was said to be in the Bible, continue this concern with the Holy Land's environment. The current barrenness of Lebanon's once forested hills, which had featured heavily in the imagery of sacred writings, is bemoaned in science and poetry alike. Sunday's first article about the Cedars reproduces a table of historical data since the 16th century to show a uniform pattern of decline in the number of trees. The poem they include is likewise doleful. What hand has laid that circuit bare, and scattered thorns and thistles there, apostate earth's too natural dress? What spell upon that scenery has made its interdicted lie, mocked by its claimed fruitfulness? You see, I thought it only appropriate to bring to an eco-criticism conference a poem about trees, or in this case the absence of trees. The scene here is characterised by a lack of cultivation, which is too natural, belonging to a non-Christian world. In the Bible, of course, thorns and thistles are absent in descriptions of the Garden of Eden and become significators of wilderness, punishment, and the final torment of Christ. The scene is also harmful to faith. Doubters can mock the Bible's claim that Lebanon was ever fruitful, given its current state. But of course this is the work or spell of God. His hand has laid the circuit bare, and could therefore be reversed, as we find in the last verse, which promises the transformation of this land. Again shall Sharon's roses bloom, and Salem rise amid the gloom. Charlotte Elizabeth Tonner's poem Palestine gives similar promises. If the people of Israel can come to terms with he who has punished them and accept Christ's help, she writes, "And will the Lord of mercy ne'er forgive? O turn to me, my people, turn and live. My Israel, turn, thy murdered Lord survey. I rend the veil and wash thy guilt away. Thy glory shall return, arise and shine. My hand upholds thee through the swelling stream. Thy darkest night with noontime splendour glows. Thy howling desert blossoms as the rose." And scientific observation supports these wild promises of reversal. The Sunday at Home explains that Lebanon's deforestation is actually caused by the population's desire for timber and tar. It's their unchristian love of profit that curses their land. But they and their land are not beyond redemption. In Palestine, the Sunday analyses soil samples and reports of missionary cultivation and concludes that the soil still possesses every ingredient that the most productive soil could possess. Observation of ruined terraces suggests that this is the state of the Palestinian souls that has led them to willfully leave the land uncultivated, like the Indians in their jungles. So I'm ending on a note of hope, that the wildernesses of the Holy Land and the Empire alike will have the potential to bloom with roses, flow with fresh water, and in short become like England's green and pleasant and Christian land. But of course, in actuality, missionaries' physiological reactions to the heathen environment were unavoidable. Missionaries had very low life expectancy in India and Africa, even in the 19th century, the late 19th century even. And Graham Brooks' demise came just 2 years after he wrote the papers that have been mentioned today. But I hope that my paper has begun to suggest how powerful and all-inclusive this evangelical imaginary of the land could be for Victorians in terms of familiarising and domesticating even the most hostile environments. If these lands from whence so few missionaries returned could be rationalised with biblical truth and scientific knowledge, then perhaps the dangers could be overcome. Thank you.